Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Daniil Karp. I'm the marketing lead here at Sixth Sense, and I'll just do a couple of quick introductions before we begin. So first, I'm very happy to have Carrie Cunningham again with us. If you've been joining us for our webinar series over the past couple of months, you know that he's no stranger. Carrie Cunningham has more than 20 years of experience in B2B demand creation and management, spanning a broad array of industries and markets, and he's a thought leader in the design and implementation of lead development and predictive analytics solutions for a wide array of B2B products, solutions, and services, and we're really glad to have his insights today. And second, I'm very happy to introduce Will Vasquez, who's a passionate tech sector marketing and sales professional, has a unique combination of sales, marketing, and entrepreneurial experiences, and today Will supports the demand gen efforts of the Go-To suite of products. And we're particularly happy to welcome him to the webinar and to the Sixth Sense family, and really excited to hear his insights today. So a little bit about the housekeeping for the webinar. We are recording this webinar today, and it will be available on demand at the same link that you're currently viewing it on about a minute after the webinar concludes. So if you'd like to share it with your colleagues, feel free to do so. Please, we'd like to have this be an interactive presentation, so submit your questions to Will and Carrie, and we'll save some time at the end to speak to them. And also check out our attachments section. We have a couple of great docs there for you. So about what we'll cover today, since marketing teams are really getting into 2017 planning mode, we thought that this would be a really great time to take a look at what are the right ways or what are the important things to think about when you are selecting a predictive vendor or thinking about predictive intelligence as a tactic in your marketing toolkit. And Carrie is going to give us a broad overview of the way that Serious Decisions thinks about this. And what I'm particularly excited about is having Will on the line with us today to add color and his unique experience of bringing predictive intelligence into his organization and building the team that he's built around it. So really excited about what's to come. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Carrie Cunningham.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniil. Appreciate it. And hi, everybody. So I'll dive right into it because we've got a lot to cover today. First thing we want to do is describe for everybody just what we mean when we talk about predictive analytics. And so predictive analytics, the way we think about it, especially for B2B marketing and sales, really involves two major categories of things. The first is data. In the past being up until just a couple of years ago, B2B marketers really had access only to their own data from marketing automation or Salesforce automation systems, and typically that wasn't very good. In the recent years, last couple of years, we've begun to have access to an awful lot more data that helps us understand who our customers and prospects are and characterizes them according to their behaviors, how they consume information, and those kinds of things. So we can know a lot more about our prospects now than we could even just a couple of years ago. So that's part of the equation. It's also, the other part of it is statistics. And statistics is really necessary because without them, it's very difficult for us to make sense of all of the data that we now have access to. And so the math helps us look into the data and find relationships that we couldn't otherwise see, things that would be invisible to us if we didn't have the statistics. Also helps make sure that we're not drawing conclusions based on impressions that really don't hold up in the broad market that we're trying to sell into. So statistics is used layered on top of the data to look for patterns, and those patterns are hopefully patterns that help us distinguish who are the great prospects for us and who are the not so great prospects, who are the best prospects right now that we should be selling to and which aren't. There's another category of prediction that really looks at how do you group prospects, both accounts and contacts together. So it looks at things like how do you segment, how do you develop personas. And so there are a lot of these different kinds of things that you can do with a combination of statistics and data. And when we think about what is a prediction relative to just making an observation about data, the prediction really says or helps you understand if something happened in the past, how likely is it that that thing is going to repeat in the future if I do the same thing again? And if I change what I did in the past by a little bit, how does that change what's likely to happen in the future? And being able to experiment with changes in your marketing and your audience strategies without having to actually run the programs, just by running statistical models, is a great innovation for B2B. All right, I think of this as a way of really adding intelligence to our B2B marketing and sales efforts. And so I think about the kinds of things that we've learned about human intelligence over the last half a century or so. Going back 50, 60 years, it was really believed that our brains were these general purpose learning machines, that we were kind of blank slates, and that any person could be taught anything just as easily as they could be taught anything else. But what we learned, though, as scientists began to study what happens when people have brain injuries or illnesses that knock out parts of their brains, is that they lose really specialized functions. And that led us to this understanding that our brains really aren't these blank slates and general learning machines, but have really specialized modules for helping us make better decisions and be intelligent about really specific things that are especially important to who we are as species, and especially going back tens of thousands of years. So the things on the right side of the screen are things that our brain has built-in modules for that help us be really, really smart and kind of automatically smart without having to do a lot of additional learning. And all of these modules, they share brain circuitry, but they also have these unique places in our brains where they occur. When I think of predictive analytics is kind of taking the same path. Rather than building a general analytic process in our B2B organizations, what we're seeing is that there are a lot of really specialized modules that we can add to our organization to help us start to make better decisions faster and more automatically. So when it comes to things like sourcing and prioritizing leads, we want to be able to make some of those decisions without having to have a person intervene. So I've listed out 9 different applications of data science and predictive analytics on the right side of the screen. One of the things that makes this analogy work is that these really do share a lot of the same circuits. They share a lot of the same data, and they share a lot of the same analytic processes. So once you get started with one of these, you're further down the road to using them all. And so we'll talk about just a few of these specific ones today. And we'll dive into some depth, particularly as Will shows some examples of what they've done in their organization. So we're going to go through our 5 steps for assessing predictive. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide because we're going to get right into it. We've got a lot to cover. All right, so the first thing you need to do, of course, is identify the problem that you're trying to solve and identify what kind of solution is likely to help you solve that problem. So on the left side of the screen, what we're talking about there is looking at and diagnosing your demand creation and management processes. Everything from how do we attract prospects to be interested in our solutions and our content, through how do we move people through the buyer's journey, and how do we compete with other solutions or with doing nothing? How do we get people to actually take action? And what we find when we look at this is that there are generally 3 different kinds of problems that organizations have in their demand creation and management processes. And those problems are kind of 3 big buckets. One is that you may have too many of something. And one of the things that you may have too many of is just potential targets in your target market. And if you do, then chances are you're going to need to prioritize or segment the kinds of things that prospects that you have in your target market. You may need to score and prioritize leads in your marketing automation system so that you're giving the best ones to your sales development or your sales team. So having too many of something really requires that we prioritize prospects and segments. The problem that more people have than too many of something is having too few of something. And when we think of too few of something, typically that's sales leads, right? So we're not having enough inquiries hit our marketing automation database. We're not able to attract enough prospects, so we need to go outbound and find net new prospects to go after and to approach. And so if you don't have enough of something, then you need a solution for sourcing them. And then finally, a lot of organizations, and virtually every organization, needs to improve the way that they're converting prospects through the buying process. And it may be that we're not continuing to engage prospects effectively at the top of the funnel, and so prospects are leaking out of the top of our funnels. Or it may be that later on in the demand creation and management processes, we're not competing well against other solutions. And so our messaging isn't having the impact that we want. We really need to understand our buyers and their needs better in order to continue to move them through the waterfall. And so that we think of as being able to better engage solutions or engage prospects. So there are predictive solutions really for all of those three things, for prioritizing, for sourcing, and for engaging prospects. Today we're going to start and look at what we think are the really most important solutions today, the most common ones that we see in the marketplace for predictive. And it starts today with sourcing. So sourcing was probably the second or third most important application of predictive a couple of years ago. But today we really see more organizations who are adopting predictive, adopting it in order to source better prospects, to bring better prospects into the top of the funnel. And I think as we look at this, Will, you've got some experience in this, and maybe you want to talk about.
Sure. Thank you, Kerry. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, this is really fascinating to see. I didn't even know about some of these other applications of predictive and some of the other use cases. As we approached it, my lens was demand creation, demand generation, supporting the sales organization. So sales makers, SDRs, BDRs, and corporate sales maker. We have another part of our business is, of course, online buyers and prospects. But when I approached it, when I started looking at this, it was very much about looking through the lens of, we have an established lead gen, demand gen model. What we were trying to really solve for was, better quality and higher valued accounts to improve the overall ROI of the sales organization, and to align with the types of accounts or the types of people that they really wanted to talk to. That was kind of, for me, that was the impetus, right? Understanding that there's probably some technology out there that could help us in targeting even better than we've already, been doing. We have lead scoring. We've certainly used a variety of media partners and a variety of tactics, but as we embarked upon this, we sort of set out with that idea that technology could help us. And it was our good friends at Merit Direct, who have been with us for a very long time, who actually hosted a marketing technology summit, and that's where we got introduced to predictive marketing. Certainly predictive analytics, like you make that point, predictive analytics is used across across much of the organization, and certainly within our marketing department. It was interesting to see people's reactions as we started talking about predictive marketing versus predictive analytics, and what that nuance really is, and the value proposition of what predictive marketing brings to the table. But that's after seeing some of the kind of case study results and things that directly resonated with our sales motions, the improvements in the things that we currently measure, and most importantly, of course, bottom line revenues, the kind of improvements. It wasn't just marginal, incremental improvements that we're looking at here. There was a potential for something much larger, and that was really what drew us to the opportunity of predictive. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, once we identified that there was this opportunity, and we identified, that there is a way for our department, right, demand gen, with our budget to sort of test into it, that's what started the ball rolling. Like, okay, we can do this. We have our own budget. We can carve out some of it to test into it, test and learn our way, be data-driven. But as we started to engage and understand and peel that onion back of really what is predictive, what are we getting into here, it was quite apparent that the technology and the offerings between some vendors and others varied. Some could help us specifically in lead gen for North America. Some could help us maybe in outbound prospecting or sales-owned accounts. And then others could help us with, multiple products, multiple geos. That's the type of organization we are. We're a global organization with multiple products. So it was apparent that predictive marketing could actually impact and help in a variety of our motions. And in order to start down the path, again, starting from the bottoms up like we did, it was not a tops-down thing. It was very much, how can we keep this sort of small and manageable so we can continue the path forward? But we did need to understand that eventually it was going to sort of surface up, and we were eventually going to need it to be prioritized by leadership. So while it was a small pilot that we started with, we realized that we were going to have to, of course, identify how predictive marketing supports not only the marketing strategy, but the overall org strategy. And we also set out to do that. And this slide kind of talks about how we kind of set out to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure does. And I think we'll talk about that, a couple of those considerations again in just a second, because I think they're really important, the impact on the organization and what you have to do to prepare and align the rest of the organization. A real big part of this, and this is something I think has been missing in a lot of the early implementations of predictive, is developing before you start selecting and implementing with partners, but developing a really clear understanding of what the problem is you're trying to solve, just as you were talking about. But then also, what's the impact of solving that problem? So let's say that we improve our conversion rates at the top of the waterfall. What's that going to do to our revenues 6 months from now or 9 months from now? How do we expect that this solution is going to provide a return? We think, when you think of anything that involves demand creation and management, there are a few different dimensions where you can make improvements. So you can make improvements by simply increasing the volume of prospects that you're seeing. And that's certainly one way that you can make improvements, just have more people to sell to. You can make improvements by converting more of whatever you have. You can make improvements by converting whatever you have faster. Right? So if you get things through the buying process and into revenue sooner and faster, then that's also a way that you can make improvements. So all of those things are things that you need to think about and calculate in order to understand what the value of implementing a predictive solution is going to be. What's happened early on in the life cycle of predictive, and as it has with many other technologies in marketing and sales, is that there's an unclear idea of how much of an incremental benefit implementing a solution is going to be. But there's a lot of hype around what it could possibly be. And so most people are focused on the hype of what it could possibly be instead of the reality of what it really probably should be. And even when we see things where we see incremental improvements in conversion, revenue production, you end up seeing people disappointed because it isn't changing the entire world the way that they vaguely kind of expected that it might. So anyway, long story, way to say that we need to have really clear expectations of how it's going to improve revenue production. And that's easily possible. The math is not complicated. If you're a Serious Decisions customer, we've got all kinds of tools to help you do that. But even if you're not, the math's not really complicated. It's what conversion rates, velocity, volume is going to change, and what is that going to mean to revenues a little bit later on. And then I know, Will, that you put in a lot of work in Citrix around this, so I'm sure the audience would love to hear about that.
Yeah, I did. I mean, this was important. It's such an important point because, while the marketing organization and our demand gen team, we're focused on, conversion rates and, quantity into the funnel and the quality and the signed leads and things like that. For the executive team, it was very much, okay, this is kind of gray area for us, but, based on your due diligence, your case studies, your interviews with other organizations like ours, what do you foresee? And you said the math is fairly simple. It is actually fairly simple, but I made sure to enlist my marketing analytics team, whether it be one person or a number of people, to help validate, corroborate, work with you through these things. And I was fortunate enough to have someone on that team who could, who is already sort of reporting out or has a very good rapport with the executive team in terms of their current understanding of our business and metrics. And I was able to bring that person in and say, hey, can you help me looking at the case studies and the ROI on our different motions? Let's translate that, right? Let's look at what the companies who are implementing Predictive, what kind of returns they're getting and where, and let's translate that into our business, and I can help you with that. And then let's now have you take a look at, well, what would that change look like in terms of finances in a quarter, right? And that's what I set out to do here, was basically say, okay, in 4 different scenarios, here's the different types of, changes to the levers we can pull and the metrics that we measure and the KPIs, and what the changes bottom line would be. And this, for me, was sort of my closing slide, one of the closing slides, to say, look, leadership, if you believe in this and you believe that we've done enough due diligence, and you see that we can test small, but begin this with the end in mind, then this is another way for you to look at how it impacts the business. And it was actually very effective. And your mileage may vary, your numbers will obviously, be different, and your metrics might be different. But in some way, I think this is really important to be able to, in anyone's presentation, to refer back to. This is why we're going this way, guys. This is what we're trying to achieve. And I did it, of course, in sort of a conservative financial pro forma look. Simple.
Yeah, and Will, I think that's two really important points there. One is being conservative in the estimates that you make, because even conservative changes, conservative improvements can be easily generate great ROI in a lot of cases. So they don't have to be extravagant. You don't have to say you're going to close 10 times as many deals next year as you did the year before to get ROI on Predictive. But I wonder if you could just explain, you've got a couple of ratios here and a couple of acronyms or something, so maybe you could explain what those are.
Yeah, so these are part of the demand waterfall things that, Serious Decisions, educates people on all the time, and, has reports on. I mean, these are the things that we measure. So assigned leads, ALs. So we had in scenario 1, a scenario where we had 33% reduction in assigned leads to the sales organization. So reducing volume, but looking for better quality, right? What that might
prioritizing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. This all has to do with, of course, identifying the right accounts that align to your goal. Our goal, of course, improving the value of those accounts to the sales org. We've been doing, the volume thing sort of as a, go back to your original slides about, the 3 kind of challenges. We've been doing the volume thing for a very long time, and we've been looking at how we can tweak it. With Predictive, it really just honed in for us and said, look, you can actually, transform the way you're looking at your lead flow by looking at scored accounts rather than scored leads. And so we try to model that out. If we now focus at the account level, what's that going to do? It's probably going to reduce our lead volume. And so that was some of it. And of course, to your point, once you identify those accounts, how do you prioritize them? And that's what Predictive does. That's certainly what Sixth Sense does for us. And then the next line item across the board here is assigned lead to created ops. So that's your created op rate. So we figure we're going to get, better accounts who are predicting to be in market. So for those contacts or accounts that we engage with in the sales organization, there should be an increase in the likelihood that someone has a current situation that we could possibly solve their business challenge for, right? And then, of course, the win rates. Win rates, because we were setting that stage to talk to the right people at the right time, that there's a higher likelihood that will win those deals. And then, of course, the most important thing for, if you're doing a lot of volume is any modest change in average deal size, ADS, your deal size, it could have significant effects. You kind of made mention of that earlier about deal size or about one of these metrics, increasing even 20% could have a significant bottom line effect. So this is how we try to model it out.
Great.
Yep. So I'll pass it back to you then.
Okay. Great. So I think we're good on. Do you want to go back a slide?
Yeah, I was just going to say it looks like I had a slide to talk about. Maybe just let's see. Here we go. There we go. I think this slide is kind of important because, again, for leadership, if you're looking to bring predictive into your organization, again, your leadership is not the ones that are spearheading the charge, and there's going to be quite a bit of education around it. You're going to need to kind of bring people up at different points in time. I mean, for example, some people were already exposed to predictive, and that was great. They were sort of already an ally. Some people had already been exposed to account-based marketing, and they were sort of already an ally, right? But then, some people were just not exposed at all. And so we use this, Forrester report, a few snippets out of it to help make the point, right, that this was sort of our vision of why we're moving, as a data-driven organization to aligning with testing into predictive, right? That the promise of predictive really aligns with our overall, mission and approach to our business. Mm-hmm. So this was sort of a slide that talks about that, right? What's the new world look like? What can we possibly do? Again, understanding that, if we had, marginal results in some of these areas, as I showed on the previous slide, we'd still be in a winning situation. Those are conservative numbers. It's a win if we even hit that first rung. But what people are seeing and companies are seeing in the marketplace are, X times improvements and really transformative improvements. So it's a bit of a leap, but there's a reason why we should test into it, and this just kind of helped to solidify that from a third-party research like yourself perspective. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is a building slide I used around that. I had a couple others kind of dotted in to our presentation.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think that leads kind of nicely into this question of what do we have to do as we figure out which use case we're going to take advantage of, and then who's going to be impacted by it. So we talked about the financial impact a little bit, but there are, what I think of as lifestyle changes for the people who are the ultimate consumers of leads that come from the demand gen organization. So if they're used to consuming one kind of lead that, say, comes from marketing automation and scoring, now we're going to be delivering them leads that are coming from a different source or maybe prioritized differently. Maybe they're sourced based on a different set of criteria, because now we've got this big data, high definition view of prospects. And so, Will, maybe you can talk a little bit about the difference between the leads that you have been delivering, the leads that you started to deliver with Predictive, and what kind of changes that entails for the organization and the folks consuming those leads.
Yeah, this was sort of a good exercise because, this was a gray area. It was, there's a lot of sort of nebulous concepts about, how does this really get implemented? I'm starting to understand that this is something you want to test into, that there's some upside to it, but what does it mean and how does it get applied to our use cases? So we use this kind of from to state to sort of talk through lead gen, lead scoring, which is currently based on firmographic and behavior on our owned media sites. When you apply the predictive marketing vendor or process to it, which is that little funnel of profile fit, insights, what does it give us on the other side? And what it turns to is from scoring the lead to scoring the account. And again, for whatever your goal or objective is. The same thing in our outbound motion, what are we doing now versus what could we be doing better? How can we better prioritize and identify accounts for the SalesMaker organization to make them more efficient and effective in their daily dials? The same thing with customer upsell and cross-sell opportunities. When you're in sales, especially when you're dealing with a bigger organization, you might have a small group of people, maybe even just one person, who's your main go-to person, and they may have no idea who handles another technology solution, consideration. Someone in sales might not know anyone who's the right person, or might not want to introduce you to the right person in marketing for a cross-sell opportunity. So Predictive surfaces up those opportunities from existing accounts. And then web prospects, a large volume of your web prospect traffic is anonymous. It's just unknown. And one of the things that came to light was, hey, this actually creates known identity at the account level of your web prospects. So not only is it able to give you predictions for your known web prospect and connect your known web prospect activity to your CRM or marketing automation activity, it also surfaces up insights from unknown, delivering net new opportunities that you might not have had otherwise. So all these things were sort of considerations for us, and this was just a way to kind of talk through the changes. Then this kind of leads to, okay, how does that work on the system side? And I think we talk about that a little bit later. But again, just trying to get it, from a high level and going across.
Great. And I think one of the things that's really important there too, Will, is when you think about being able to see, for instance, that there are, not only do you have visitors that you've identified, you have prospects that you're trying to reach on an outbound basis, but also being able to identify that you've got anonymous visitors coming from some of those accounts that you're trying to penetrate, or maybe you have an identified prospect. And that can give you a much more accurate picture of the degree of interest and demand that you're generating within those accounts.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, that is a huge insight, and it is a potentially huge opportunity, because if you're a sales maker and you have an account that's already you've landed, you have no idea that someone else in your organization is in market for something else you sell. You just happen to miss them because you've never been introduced to them, and they don't even know about you, and they're already a corporate account. It's hard to expand a lot of times. You can expand on the current product pretty easily, but cross-selling another product, this is where, having Predictive actually can create a new lead source, which is not easy to do. Identify a new source of leads for an organization. It has a lot of promise, and we're still in the middle of really understanding the full impact of it, but we're very excited about it.
That's great. And so that's really this account-centric and account-based view of the world. And I know you've got some thoughts around that as well.
Yeah. So, this slide was kind of to talk about, what the implications are. For example, with Predictive, you're going to be pivoting to account-based marketing, right? You're going to be pivoting to organizing around the account. And we were forced to start to think about what that would be like in our new world. And it's an exercise that's still ongoing. I mean, when we approached testing into Predictive, we said we can't go into this as if we're bringing in a new marketing automation platform, a new CRM. This is a tool, like you kind of alluded to in the brain example. This is part of the whole, and we cannot, for example, modify deeply some systems integrations in order to test into this. We had to be able to test small and utilize existing conduits, existing technologies, and we found that we were able to do it, and Sixth Sense has been tremendous in working with us in that way, as has been some of our other vendor partners. So basically, you know, and one of the other things that was interesting, the third line here about marketing spend efficiencies, something that was really brought to light after we started walking down this path. It's sort of been the gift that keeps on giving as we keep going down the path of predictive. But we recognized partway into this that because we're going to be now, receiving the predictive insights, we can actually focus our media spend on accounts that are truly in market. Versus right now, we really don't know, who's in market or who's really going to be a higher value versus a smaller value account. So we're getting a lot closer to that, and we can increase efficiencies in media spend by applying it to accounts that are in market and potentially keeping that marketing engine going through op creation and through close one or close loss. So that was another insight I thought that was very important. And one of the items here that is distinct about Sixth Sense is having, a funnel view. So we also recognize as we started down this path that different vendors have different core competencies and certain approaches. There are some things that are consistent across them, and then there's some unique attributes. And, for example, lead gen, was a little bit easier to execute. Sales-owned accounts was fairly easy to execute. But it didn't then also, what it didn't give us is the ability to match our conversation, our engagement with the prospect's position in the funnel, their journey, where they are. And, being able to match an engagement with a decision maker or an influencer in the awareness stage is different than having that discussion with someone just down in consideration or decision stage. So we're excited about the opportunity to understand and align to the buyer's journey, and this helps give us more insight, which is what we're seeking into the buyer's journey. So another thing that kind of came through it.
Yeah, that's perfect. It's I think really important to have all of those different objectives in mind and the different potential benefits. And so from there, we want to pivot a little bit and talk about how you put together the team that does the evaluation, because that really does speak to how you're going to keep all of those different possibilities in mind. When we look at a typical buying committee from the selling perspective, things look like this, right? We've got champions, influencers, we've got CXOs who sign off on deals, we've got end users we've got to satisfy. If we think about this specific example, like a prospect sourcing, which is one of the applications that you had, then we could roll through and look at who some of the different people who would need to be involved in the evaluation process, people who are either impacted or will have an important perspective on what we ought to consider. So, oops, I went one too far. We'll just skip over that. No, I'll just name them. So, director of demand gen, for instance, an IT contact, either the CM or CSO, depending upon where in this organization you're going to be working the leads. You've got the lead recipients themselves, folks who have to be involved and make sure that they're on board, aligned, understand, and have input to the model. And then, maybe even people from procurement, project management, et cetera. So the slides are moving a little slow. I'm just going to skip, Will, to your next slide where you can talk about the team that you all put together there, the cross-functional team to evaluate predictive. And I see those slides.
Sure. Okay, I can see it. Yep. Yeah. So, building a cross-functional team was critical. I'll tell you, we started with a very small team. It was just, me and my direct manager talking about how we can improve the lead gen motion. We had been exposed to a case study that Sixth Sense, had a guest speaker, like I mentioned earlier, And we said, we've got to try this. And she said, okay. And that's how we started. But it was very clear that, other people were going to need to be involved. And so the cross-functional teams started to be built. And I can't stress enough how important it is to build these relationships with your team. It has been the essence of our success to date, just being able to reach across and, introduce myself to someone, let them know, walk them through the deck, why we're doing this, and, let them know that there's a chance that something may come of this, come across their desk, and, this is why we might make an ask of you, right? So that's how it sort of starts out. And then it's just been growing ever since. There's about 27 people on this slide. Our core team is it was started off 2 or 3 of us. It's now our core team's probably about 6 or 7 now that we're, really into it. But we've had to reach across, to all these different functional groups to help us with implementation and or measurement. And the analytics team is, of course, a key part of that. So it's good stuff.
Well, I would imagine that there were people with different levels of understanding or came into this process with different levels of understanding of predictive or what predictive is and all of that. Did you have to deal with helping get people up to speed from different starting points?
Absolutely. Part of my conversations, especially when I had email conversations with these teams, are, by the way, this is what we're talking about, and here's some resources for you to take a look at that maybe put that together. I would refer to Serious Decisions decks or Forrester decks or, this something on the internet about this or that or predictive, or of course our deck, that we put together internally to walk them through. It was great when people already had an understanding of it. And for people who didn't, it was, well, step back, take some time to at least give them a broad understanding. And that's an important thing about, I guess being the driver or the champion of the project is to really just try and get the deepest level of understanding you can and then simplify it for people. That's been what our approach has been. Try to simplify it, make it as simple as possible to get the buy-in you need.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. And so we've spent a lot of time talking about figuring out which use cases are relevant to you and understanding what the impact of that's going to be, putting together the right group of people to evaluate. So, those are things that we think probably there hasn't been enough time spent on those aspects of the evaluation so far. So really glad to have Will share everything that they've done there. Once we've done all that, we've really got to, so we've talked about narrowing down the use case a little bit. I'll just mention that, Serious Decisions, you can just, even if you're not a client of ours, you can go to our marketplace website and you can see listings of vendors, descriptions of vendors, and what they do, what categories they play in. So you can certainly take advantage of that if you are a client of ours, and we're more than happy to talk to you about different vendors and how to go about filtering which ones handle the use cases that are of interest to you. Once you've done that, there are some other standard kinds of questions that you need to ask vendors when you're looking at a predictive vendor. One is what we think of as the market scope. So if you sell to SMBs, you need to make sure that your predictive vendor has data in the SMB space that you sell into. And if you're selling into large enterprises, you've got to make sure that they've got that covered. Relatively straightforward to test, but you need to do that as an early filter on the vendors that you're looking at. Also, the industry that you're selling into. I talked to a client recently that sells strictly into the space of automotive dealerships. Right? So they had a pretty good idea of how many automotive dealerships of the kind they sell to are in the United States. You can test your predictive vendors to make sure that your predictive vendors have the accounts and they have data for the accounts that you're interested in. So that's something that you can relatively simply test, and you need to do that. Another really important one, and more important as we continue along in this process of the evolving predictive space, is if I've got markets outside of North America, does my vendor or do the vendors cover the markets that I'm interested in? Do they have complete data sets in Asia or in Europe or Latin America, and what does that look like? Those are relatively straightforward things to look for and to test. It's really important to make sure that the vendor not only can tell you that they have something, but they can show that they have it, that they have customer references that can demonstrate that they've got those markets that you're interested in covered. So that's the first kind of level of evaluation that you need to look at. Just do they cover the markets and the spaces that you need to be in? The second is going to be in integrations with the systems that you need to integrate with. And Will was just alluding to this. You know, if you're bringing leads into the organization, or if you're scoring and prioritizing leads or customers that are already in the organization, that really implies a pretty high degree of integration with your existing systems. Now, it is possible that you could take advantage of Predictive in some senses without integrating with any systems, but it's probably not going to be possible to optimize your investment in Predictive without at least integrating with your Salesforce automation systems, with marketing automation systems. If, as Will was talking about, you want to drive media buys from Predictive, then it's going to need to integrate with the systems that drive that programmatic media buying as well. So there are a lot of systems that might need to be integrated there, and another test that you make of the Predictive vendors is, can they demonstrate that they have these integrations or that they can do these integrations? Do they have customer references that back that up? Another consideration that's really important for a lot of organizations, if you're going to be touching our customer or even our prospect data, are you going to be able to have that secured, and is that vendor certified in the way that your organization needs them to be when they're touching prospect and customer data? So really important to make sure that you have the right resources in place to evaluate that, and that even before you go down the road of a pilot with somebody, that you check to see whether you're likely to get an answer that's acceptable in these areas. All right, so we'll keep moving pretty quickly through a couple of these things, because we've got some other really good content we want to get to from Will. I'm going to skip past this because I think we're going to talk about this in just a minute. One of the things that we've seen early on in the implementation of Predictive is that we've got a top-down versus bottom-up issue that I'll describe here. When you're delivering leads to salespeople or to lead development reps, those salespeople and lead development reps already have an idea of what a good prospect looks like. So they get trained, they're conditioned by their managers and supervisors and all of that to know what a good prospect looks like. They know who they want to talk to. We call that a top-down view of the world. So they have this idea in their head of what a good prospect looks like, and then they go out and look for something that looks like that idea that they have in their mind, that kind of ideal prospect. What Predictive is, though, is a bottom-up process. A bottom-up process is one that begins with data, and it starts with a big set of data, and it looks for ways to identify prospects. It doesn't start with an idea about what the data should say, but instead lets the statistics and the math make the decisions about what makes a good prospect itself. So when you have a bottom-up process that's being essentially deployed into a top-down environment, which is sales and sales development, it's really important that you do the job in advance of mapping the bottom-up to the top-down. And what that looks like in practice is your predictive model may end up with dozens or hundreds of variables in it. Those dozens or hundreds of variables probably mostly point to things that a sales rep would think is important about that prospect or those prospects. And so it's important that if you're rolling out a model and predictive leads to a sales team, that when you send that lead to reps, you should be able to describe why the model thinks that lead is important. Doesn't mean you have to know what all hundreds of the variables are, but it means that you need to understand that, here's what the variables in the model are pointing at. They're pointing at the fact that this company has been doing a lot of research on solutions in this area. It's pointing to the fact that they have old technology in the web conferencing area. All those kinds of things that a sales rep is going to be thinking about, and you've got to make sure that you can map that and talk to that in advance. Otherwise, you're going to end up sending leads to reps, and reps are going to look at them and say, "Hey, I don't understand why I got this one." And you're going to go, "I don't understand it either," right? And you don't want to be at that point. You really want to understand that in advance. And so, Will, maybe you want to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I kind of chuckle to myself because you make a really good point, and it's something that everyone's going to have to cross that bridge. And I'll tell you, the salespeople, they're pretty simple because if you keep it high level, the thing that you don't want to do is go into that bottoms up with the sales organization. Maybe your sales op person, might end up getting into the weeds. But if you start, I've had this happen to me a couple of times where, they're excited. They're like, I've been hearing about this predictive. It sounds good. What's it all about? And if I start talking about any of the bottoms up details, it's, the eyes roll back in their head. It's like,
that's right.
It's like, no, okay, let me start over again. We're going to tell you what the big fish are, which ones are hungry, which ones are biting. Okay, so you can decide when you turn on your computer and you look at your account base, we're going to help you prioritize to go after the accounts that are going to give you potentially the best deal size, the best opportunity, and who are in market, who are profiled to be actually have a current situation and a need, and are demonstrating that. And that education comes along with, what you're talking about here. So I keep the conversation with sales at that level as much as possible. Anyone who's asked me about it, that's what it's all about. But the bottoms up part, the systems, I'll tell you, for everyone on this call, it's really important to try and dig into that systems part early and as soon as possible, especially if you're in a large organization, because eventually those systems are going to be impacted, and you might have, you might need to put it on a priority that might not happen this quarter. It might happen next quarter. It might not happen for 2 quarters. But you need to bring in those marketing automation and sales automation, sales ops folks as soon as you can. We kind of had a balancing act, right? We thought we were going to be able to kind of, keep this small. In fact, we executed 3 tests. One that was completely controllable in our department, one that was a reach across to another functional group, and the 6 Sense implementation, which ultimately meets all of our criteria and requirements for a multinational corporation like ours and multi-products. And that, of course, then span all of these different functional groups that we talked about earlier. So yeah, you make that previous slide of yours is an important one. It can get very complicated, but with small steps and engaging the right people and with the relationships, I got to tell you, it's really easy to have something fail when you just give it to someone else and say, "Hey, this is what we need." But when you're deeply engaged and you develop those relationships with people, it helps to get things going, to keep that process moving forward for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the slide that's on the screen now is really summarizing, I think, a lot of the things that we've already talked about. Will's talked about a lot: engaging other stakeholders, making sure that you're communicating effectively, that you understand what value is likely to be delivered, and that you have a reasonable approach to how long it will take to get to that delivery. Whenever it involves sales leads, everybody wants them yesterday, and they have to have been better than the ones that we were getting 2 yesterdays ago. But we've got to be realistic about that, or we set up expectations that are going to be disappointing for people when they're not met. And so, the other piece that I would just mention here is that you've got to have a vendor that you work with who's going to understand all of those things, who can demonstrate that they've worked with other clients to help them do these things, engage stakeholders, communicate effectively, and all of that. And all of that makes that vendor easier to work with for you and will help you get to the point where you can be successful. Just one last slide, I think, for me that I want to make sure that we touch on a little bit. So there's really a few different levels of evaluation of predictive vendors. And one of the things that's difficult about predictive, and has been over the first few years of the development of this space, is that it's difficult to evaluate a predictive vendor directly. So what I mean by that is you're not going to be able to look at the algorithms that they use and compare one vendor's algorithms to another vendor's algorithms. You're not even going to be able to look directly at their data sets that they use and compare those directly with data sets from another vendor. So you're not going to be able to do that. That would be the most direct way to do that. If that were possible and you had the resources who could do that, that would be awesome. But if you did, you probably wouldn't need the vendor anyway. So you have to evaluate them indirectly. And indirectly means that in the early going, as we talked about, they've got to show evidence that they can do the things that you need them to do. They've got to have, see demos of their system, but also talk to customers who do similar things or have them do similar things for you. And then once a vendor passes that test, that they can demonstrate that they've done what you need, and have done it for other folks, then you've got to put a pilot in place, or put a program in place, right? And start actually engaging and looking at the output from the models, using the output from the models, and seeing what kind of results you can generate. Will, I don't know if you want to add to kind of what that process was like for you all.
No, I think that did come up. I'll tell you, with the analytics team, it definitely came up. Like, okay, this is how I would like to evaluate the capabilities and potential for going for one vendor or the other, and you're not going to get, to their technology, right? It is their unique value proposition. So you do have to find other ways that achieve your objectives. And we've been fortunate, and it's there for you. You just gotta, define your use case, in detail, get everyone who's involved in that motion to weigh in. That was a big part of it, understanding, okay, what is the current situation? What is the hypothesis of applying predictive? Now, everyone agrees that, these are the KPIs that are going to be measured, and then come back to your vendors and say, excuse me, how can I test with you, and learn and scale? What are my options of engagement with your company? And that's how we approached it.
Great. So good. I think we have a couple of minutes left for questions, if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you for that. Thank you for that presentation. So just a quick question for you guys, take it a little bit broader. As marketing teams get into 2017 planning, and this is for both of you, if they're not already as deep into their thinking about predictive, and they're just at the very onset of, well, what could this technology do for me? How could it fit into our lead to revenue process? Where would you set them to start thinking about, and how should they start thinking about predictive?
I'll jump in real quickly and say, begin by understanding what are the goals that you need to achieve in this coming year. What's the gap between where you are and where you need to get? And then compare that gap and the need that you need to fill with what predictive can offer. And so, we talked about a number of things that predictive can offer today. We've got a lot of content that people can go to as well.
Yeah, and I just add to that, the nice thing about predictive is that you have vendor partners who can allow you to start with smaller investments and scale. Once you go down this road, just do a little bit of research, understand if you can align the results of what predictive is delivering for other companies to what your needs are, what could produce, better profitability for your organization. And if there's alignment there, go down the path. And I would encourage you to go down the path. You can start small and then test and learn your way through.
Terrific, thank you. And just one last question for you, Will. What were the capabilities that you were looking at that ended up being the key decision makers when you were making a decision around predictive?
So ultimately, our capabilities, were that someone could handle, a vendor could handle multiple products. So predicting for accounts that might be a market across our product segments and in multiple geos. That was the beginning with the end in mind. But we also needed to sort of prove the concept that predictive does work. And so that's why we had multiple tests, and we were able to prove that with just one product first and then scale out. And we're still in some of those tests, quite frankly, but that was our approach. So understanding where you need to ultimately be might be a way for you to start or for someone to start. That's what one of the things that we wanted to do as a large organization is if we're going to go down this path, yes, we want to test and learn and understand that the technology does have the merit that can deliver on what its promise is. It can integrate within our current systems and then find someone, identify at least one vendor that can eventually become a test partner across the entire organization.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who joined us today. We're going to conclude on that note. And as I mentioned, this webinar will be available on demand afterwards. Thank you, Will and Carrie.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.